Hi, everyone. Welcome to another live stream version of the podcast. So if you were listening on the podcast, you're listening on Get Jashed. If you're listening on YouTube, you can go subscribe to the podcast. There's a whole bunch of other things on there as well. I am just going to dive right in because I'm really excited that I'm getting to do this. It has been a little bit of a hiatus for podcast episodes and live streams alike. And the reason for that is the topic for today's episode or today's conversation. And that is around how to find your practice of well-being when big things are happening. So where are we? Just over 7 weeks ago, I had surgery. Everything's fine. One thing I will say is for surgery, especially of the female kind, please take it seriously. And please realize that most of the time it's actually more serious than what we might have been led to believe. That's a totally separate conversation and issue, but it's also very relevant in terms of the length of time it's taken for me to recover and get back to my usual routine. So everything is fine, but this surgery, what I was told initially was 2 weeks off work, which felt big enough as it was. And then I found out in week 3 that it was actually 6 weeks of all kinds of exercise. And that's where we are leading into this particular topic today, because that then made this a whole lot bigger than what I was prepared for or knew to prepare for or had ever kind of dealt with personally. And I say this having worked with so many soldiers in particular in the course of my work over the course of the last 7 years, but soldiers who are, physically injured, for example, who have to find other ways of taking care of their well-being. And this is something that, for me, I wasn't physically injured. It wasn't this indefinite time frame. So I kind of knew there was a time frame, but it still required me to dig deeper into what those well-being practices were. The reason this is because as someone with autism and ADHD, movement, if not exercise, but definitely exercise, but movement is one of those really key regulating tools for me. And it also helps me to make sense of my sensory awareness. And recovering from surgery, there is also an element of sensory overload when I could have told you at some point in time exactly how many internal stitches I had, or exactly where they were at least. So there was a lot that came up when I realized I couldn't do those things, while at the same time, literally within the same week, I started my master's in applied positive psychology. So I started my master's, had surgery, and this has been the experience for the whole time so far. But it's actually been really, really useful because it has helped remind me of a few things. Again, this is exactly why we're here having this conversation. It's helped remind me of a few things. One being that one of the assessments that I've had to do is writing an application of a positive psychology wellbeing intervention that I'm performing on myself. So it was really easy to sort of capture what that need was, but it turned out really easy to also tap into the reminder of all of these things that I've been talking about for years anyway. So there is a validation in that. One question I get a lot is, what is well-being? Or one question that comes up in conversation is, what is well-being? And what is well-being when your routines change? What is well-being when you suddenly don't have access to the usual tools for whatever reason, how do you then access a wellbeing practice? How do you practice something when what you really need is something that you can't access? And this is a I want to have this conversation. I'm not just talking about me. I, Mine is just such a small example, but I want to have this conversation because sometimes we put well-being on a moral pedestal, and make it a moral choice of whether someone takes care of themselves in a certain particular way or not. And sometimes we take it for granted, and that's not a fault either, because if we are used to life being a certain way, of course, us humans come to expect it to continue, we want to expect it to continue being that way. But there is also going to be times where we get to view our experience through a lens that is not our usual experience, and this is what that was for me. Despite all of the training I've done in recognizing other people's experiences, like trauma awareness in particular, because we can't cookie cutter or copy and paste one expected experience onto another. And yoga has taught me that. Teaching yoga has taught me that even in a particular pose or hold or stretch, there is not a rule that says this is exactly where you're going to feel this, because each person has it differently. Each person experiences it differently. But what I found was the challenge in my routine changing and not being able to do the thing that would help me. But then when I could, like going for walks, it was creating more of another issue of sensory overload and overwhelm, which was sort of just undoing the whole point anyway in that way. So I had to dig deep. And I say this very ironically, because what I ended up being reminded of was an exact practice that I already teach, soldiers in particular, that I already teach, that has a lot of research behind it. This was as part of my assessment that I had to carry out and do and then write about. But what this taught me was sometimes it has to be simple, and sometimes it gets to be simple. Sometimes it's not overcomplicated. Even though I'm a big fan of taking care of yourself and valuing health and, taking care of your physical body and your spiritual body and your emotional body, I am a big fan and advocate for that in myself and in others. There is a reminder for us all that sometimes it comes down to the simplicity. And the simple things are easier to access when we practice them, when we don't, quote, need them, right? So breath work, for example, we breathe by default anyway, like we breathe automatically. It's an automatic function of the body. And yet we can also control it to an extent. We can also control it, and that can also then influence or impact our state. So breath work is really powerful for that reason, but we dismiss it because it seems so simple. So even as a stress relief, as a stress management tool, as something that helps bring us homeostasis, that helps bring us balance and coherence, our human brains, very healthy human brains, want to just go straight to, well, what's the big solution? What's this big, complicated solution that's going to make me feel like I've actually solved a problem? Versus, what if I spend 5 minutes every day just breathing in a slow, steady, conscious way, like mindful way? What if I just spend 5 minutes every day just doing that? It feels too simple. So we don't do the things that we already know of until we feel like we need them. And I say this, ask me how I know. I say this because this is exactly the experience I went through. Until we are reminded that they are there. And thank God we have those reminders. But here is your reminder. For any of those things, for me, it was breath work and a body scan, like a body rotation meditation. The kind I teach is iRest, Integrative Restoration Yoga Nidra. Um, and it's got a lot of research behind it, in particular with defense and veterans. So it feels like a really safe and secular catch-all for everyone that gives everyone, meets everyone where they're at as best as possible, at least. Um, so that's what I was reminded of: the breath work and the body scan. Something that I've taught, can't tell you how many times, and then I have said these exact words. The body scan helps you to feel more present and relieve stress. And what I was finding that I needed was to feel more present and to relax. That's actually what I needed. There was a stress element involved, but what I identified was I need something that's more relaxation focused, because I can't move energy physically the way that I normally would. I'm using a lot of cognitive energy, especially on uni stuff, because I had time, but I wasn't going to the gym. I had time to do uni things. So my brain was already busy enough. I needed something that was going to switch that gear for me, change that gear for me. But this is also something that if someone else were to ask me for them, I would have immediately said this to them. The reason I didn't immediately think of it is because I was stuck on what I wanted that I couldn't access. There's a lesson in that too. But what I wanted that I couldn't access, which is movement. And for various reasons, I couldn't access that due to either pain or discomfort that was real, or the risk of disrupting that healing process and leading to potential further injury. So there was this reminder that I could only laugh at, that was, oh, this is something I already teach. This is something I actually know. But I was so focused on the lack. I was so focused on the thing I couldn't do that I kind of just dismissed, without even realizing that I was addressing it. But I kind of just dismissed the thing that I could do because it didn't feel like enough. And here's what I've learned from that. Sometimes it just won't be exactly what you want it to be, but it can still be supportive. So what is supportive won't always necessarily be what you want it to be, but it will still be supportive. That was a big thing. And it still is. It's a big thing because there's a depth to that reminder that it's not just about when you're recovering from abdominal surgery, or, it's not just about the very surface level. There is an element of a lesson in that in every layer and aspect and factor of life that I can think of off the top of my head, at the very least. But sometimes what is supportive for you, or what is the most accessible and supportive for you, isn't necessarily going to be exactly what you want it to be. But how can you allow yourself to receive that or to follow through on that? Sometimes it's an active choice, right? You have to actually do it. How can you allow yourself for that to be sufficient enough? The other thing is practicing something. I've already sort of touched on this, but practicing something even when you don't have to. Practicing something when you're not in a stressed state. Let's use that as a general catch-all. Practicing something when you're not in a stressed state is the best way and time to practice it, even though we don't have that need driving us, the pain point necessarily driving us. If we practice it when we feel like we don't particularly need it, it is so much easier to access when you are in that stress state, because your brain is not necessarily going to be thinking as rationally as it usually would be when it is in stress or overwhelm. I'm not saying it's not rational, but it won't necessarily be thinking as rationally or access those things, those simple, supportive things, as easily as it usually would be because it is in a stress state. It is already there. So if you make it part of something that you already know, that maybe you've already practiced, so you already have embodied it, at least to a degree, you already feel it, you know what it feels like, then it makes it easy to access. It becomes less of a question mark and more of something that you can just go, oh yeah, that, which is exactly what happened. So that is a really, really good reminder because this, like I said, this is something I've been teaching for years. So technically I have been practicing it in states where I haven't needed it. And even I forgot it momentarily. And the moment I was reminded of the possibility, I hadn't even reached that whole end state yet, but the moment I was reminded of just a snippet of it, I was immediately able to accept it and receive it and go, oh, yes, actually that, oh, and this is what I can do. So my brain just filled in the blanks based on what it knew. So I was able to then do that. It's a really important time to do it because it makes these things more accessible to us. If we are in a state where, and realistically, there are going to be people in our world or in our lives who are just in a constant stress state. So they're not really having that reprieve of being able to practice something out of a stress state because they're just constantly in it. Just practice what you can. It doesn't mean you have to wait, right? You just start and do what you can. And something else with that I want to bring in is this reminder that dropping into the body takes time. Of course, it takes time. Dropping into the body is not necessarily going to be an immediate thing when you have either spent time actively trying not to be in your body for whatever reason, or it's just something that you haven't practiced. Dropping into your body will take time sometimes. And again, that is not a moral failing. It's not a failing at all, but it's not a moral failing on your part at all. It's just information. For me, I've noticed that because I've spent the better part of almost 8 weeks actively trying not to be in my body because it was overwhelming. I was in sensory overload. And even beyond the initial acute pain part of it, I was in sensory overload. It was a lot. It was just a lot, and I felt unprepared. So I was actively trying not to be in my body. I was trying to just do everything that I could do, whether that was uni work or just staying up late reading. I've noticed this pattern. I hadn't had surgery since I was 19, and that was my wisdom teeth, so it was a different experience. But I remembered the 2 weeks after that, I was unusually staying up very, very late, just reading. And even though sleep is a great option, right? I realized when it sort of happened again this time, but after the first 2 weeks, because it was abdominal, it was a very different experience. I needed sleep first. So it was week 3 and 4 that I was suddenly finding myself in that pattern, that habit again of, oh, it's really late. And all I want to do is read. And I realized it's because, and this is my experience, but I realized it's because reading for me, I really enjoy it because it drops, it brings me to the present, but also it gives my brain a break. So I was going to say it helps me dissociate. It's a version of that, but it gives my brain a break from reality, really. So what I was unconsciously doing was doing that. And that's what I needed. And it's also something that I needed to at least recognize what was happening so then I could make the conscious choice. Because both times, back when I was 19, by the way, knew so minimal of what I know now, right? So we're talking 16 years difference. Jesus, 16 years difference. Maybe I was 20. Anyway, I noticed both times it started happening first. It wasn't a choice. So there is no judgment on these things that your body does or your brain does to protect you in a way. But when we can at least notice it and then maybe make that a choice, it becomes a lot easier. Having said that, I was able to start doing at home. Like, so for me, it's like, you know, I always call it like bigger weights at the gym. And for me, this was like, oh, it's little bigger weights. It was really good though, because I was able to just do this little at home workout that allowed me to use some of those muscles. And I've noticed I've lost a lot of that muscle strength. But then when I went to a yin class, a yin yoga class at the end of the week, and for those who don't know what yin yoga is, I actually have a couple of videos on my YouTube if you want to have a nice safe practice. But it is I would call it a relaxed, more relaxed class, but it can be intense with stretches. It depends on how you practice it. If you practice it with a lot of support, hopefully you can do that to sort of help protect yourself. But yeah, it's very grounded and supportive, but focused on the opening and the stretch, particularly to help you open up through the connective tissue. So I went to a yin class knowing that was going to be really good for me. And it was a beautiful class with this teacher in particular. It was, as always, it was beautiful. And I noticed that even though I knew what it could feel like, and I've taught yin for years, I've done it for years, even though I knew, I also realized or noticed, without judgment, but I also noticed that I wasn't dropping into my body much because my brain was so analytical to the physical experience that felt brand new. The physical experience felt brand new because it had been 8 weeks since I'd done anything really like that. And I'd had a whole surgery and nothing else in between. So no continuity of any physical things. So my body had changed in a way, like it may not look so much from the outside, but the sensations in my body had changed, at least for now. And I noticed that I spent the time being analytical of those sensations because they felt brand new. And if that happens to you, like it did to me, or even differently, that is a normal experience. That's a super normal experience because it is brand new. So it's okay if your brain does come in and go, hey, what's this? Oh, that's interesting. Oh, that's what my hip feels like. Did it always feel like that? This was what was going through my brain. It was like, oh, okay, yeah, I like this stretch. I always like this stretch. But that's an interesting sensation with my hip, not pain, just interesting because it's like it's there. Oh, I didn't know my hip was there. So in a way, it was in my body, but there was a very analytical viewpoint of it. And that is just the reminder again that the experience is only part of it. One of the most common pieces of feedback or questions about the experience that students will ask me or give me is, they will say, "Oh, well, I didn't feel relaxed at all. My brain was so busy. I just suck at this. I just suck at this practice, or I'm not doing it right, or usually it's some version of I'm not doing it right." When really we're meant to give our brain time to relax, to process, actually, is the word I was looking for. We're meant to give our brain time to process. We're meant to give our brain time to process information, all the information that we throw at it, even if it's not a problem, it needs time to process. And if we are only saving that time for when we're trying to go to sleep, we're not doing our brain a service, we're not doing ourselves a service. So it is normal that sometimes you're going to be in your head a little bit when you take the time, because your brain's like, oh my gosh, thank you. I just need to think all these things through, because we're not necessarily giving ourselves time and space for it to do that. So the experience is only part of your practice. Obviously, you want to have a safe feeling experience for you, and there's a lot of different layers in that. So, we're not looking for activation necessarily, but the experience is only part of the practice in terms of what it means to take time for yourself in any of these ways, whether it has got to do with yoga or meditation of some form, or any other mindfulness based intervention. For some people, it's surfing, right? Like, so anything that you do that is time spent not actively doing or fixing or in your head, right? Not trying to be in your head. The experience is only part of it. Some days you'll have a really like beautiful, mushy Zen experience. Other days, it's just going to be busy, because showing up consistently is the main part. Even if it's tiny, tiny little moments, showing up even 5 minutes a day, but 5 minutes a day is way better than trying to force half an hour or an hour every month. You're like, oh shit, I haven't done anything. Let me force this. And then wondering why it feels like torture. So the showing up for you part is actually doing a lot more than what you might think if you're only judging it based on how actively different do I feel on this side. So I share all of that to just kind of share what's been going on my end, but from that perspective of what I've learned, that is also just a reminder of everything. Like if you've been in any class or session or anything with me, it's everything that we've already spoken about, but it's this reminder of the practical application of life will life. So sometimes it feels like a step back when really it's just this experience that we're having. So can we meet ourselves there in the experience instead of continually forcing ourselves to feel a certain state? Can we meet ourselves in there and guide ourselves through? It's not that we shouldn't, aspire to feel better, right? But instead of trying to force it or expect it all the time, or think that it is a step back, if we have to, pause and deal with a very human life thing, right? It's not, it's just an experience. There are limits to that, obviously. There are extremities in occurrence that we don't want to dismiss or bypass and use this as a way to bypass. That's not what I mean at all. I'm talking about just our very general everyday lives, when they are more or less just tracking along. Can we meet ourselves in the experience and go, okay, cool. I was in my head a lot during that practice. All right. Must have been what I needed. I'm going to keep showing up. That's really the difference, right? It's like, I'm going to keep showing up for myself and see what happens. That is the learning, because what those practices are going to be different for each kind of person. That's the beauty in well-being based interventions, is that there is no copy and paste, but there is a lot of research-based interventions that we can just try on and see what works. But that is the beauty of it. Um, and I wanted to share that, and I needed to tell that little bit of a story from the experience of the last 2 months that I've had. Um, Not because anything's wrong, everything's really good, really, but um, that is the experience of being in it in real time. Even when you teach it, none of it's perfect, and if we stop, if we just remove the perfection from our expectations of what our well-being practice is, whether that's got to do with what you eat or how you exercise or how much you exercise, all of the things that we see a lot of that are good for us, but also, are they good for us when we are being awful to ourselves? Can we remove the expectation of perfection on ourselves, on what the practice is, and allow us to show up and see what it is, and just see where we're at, and then we are more able to respond to our needs in a fluid, as needed way. Sometimes that need is structure. Again, ask me how I know. I need structure, an element of structure, but I had to find a different way to give myself that so that I could help tend to my nervous system, because it was one of those times where I didn't have just that straightforward playbook of Jess and how I regulate, right? It needed to be a new page or a new chapter or an addendum, and it needed to be, hey, in case of this, you might find this happens. And I learned that about myself. So I hope that's been helpful as a little revisit to doing these weekly again, here again. I hope that's been helpful. I will be doing another next week, and then probably um, two while I'm away in New York for a couple of weeks. So there's going to be a lot of learnings in that too, just from the everyday, right? But just these reminders. So yeah, thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. And I'll see you all again next week.